Give your Windows 10 box a nice solid state disk drive, give it plenty of RAM, give it that great CPU, and performance should be off the charts. What happens though if there is performance issues? In fact, one of the main things I want to do in this nugget is let's talk about some specific metrics. And we know when we say metrics, we should be thinking counters in a tool like Performance Monitor. Let's look at some specific values we should scrutinize. Now, obviously, as I alluded to in the introduction, the first thing that we're going to check when we have a poorly performing system, and remember the reliability monitor that we covered in a nugget, that's going to be a cool tool that we could, immediately pull up when we visit this new system. But obviously, we're going to check those minimum hardware requirements. If those check out, like, a lot of times you'll see a machine performing poorly and you're scratching your head because it does have a solid state disk drive. It's got, let's say, 16 gig of RAM. It's got the latest, greatest Intel processor. We want to start going through and checking some of the best practice areas, and really we could rename this list as potential problem areas too, couldn't we? We want to make sure we go through the appropriate disk care mechanisms that you and I did together when we were talking about storage in this course. Number one, we need to make sure that they do have plenty of free space. We know that free space is going to be critical for Windows 10 to work its magic, and if they get super short on storage space, we know this can impact performance. But when I say disk care and feeding here, I'm talking about like removing those temporary files, keeping the disk nice and clean, going through the disk optimization, and Windows will typically do this for us now just beautifully on an automated schedule. Making sure that we're checking the disk for errors and things of that nature. A lot of times we find that users are complaining about the performance of their system, and it's actually some issue with their internet connection. So let's make sure that internet isn't the bottleneck. And by the way, bottleneck is a great term here because when we start checking specific metrics on performance, what we're really looking for is some type of performance bottleneck. Like maybe it's the I/O on the system with the storage system that's causing the problem, or maybe it is some type of problem with bad memory, etc. Maybe there's an application that is suddenly performing very poorly. I know a personal example of this for me in the Cisco networking arena is a virtual simulator for Cisco systems called GNS3. If you do not have GNS3 tuned properly, it becomes a remarkable CPU hog. I mean, to the point where it could destroy physical hardware. It is so incredibly taxing of the CPU in your system. So we would use the performance monitoring tools that we know about in order to make sure some app isn't freaking out on us. Malware, that's one of the things that malware does, is it makes your machine run poorly. And oftentimes, then a technician would call someone like they did with my mother, true story, and they said, we can fix your PC. We know it's having problems. This was a ransomware type situation. And of course, she fed them her Visa credit card number to fix her system, true story. And her son works in IT full time. Alrighty, now that I've recovered from that story, let's finally mention that another thing that we see frequently is there is a million startup apps. And you go into the Task Manager view on the Startup tab, and you see that not only are there a million startup apps, but they all have a potentially heavy impact on performance on the system. Now, as I alluded to, you and I discussed an incredible number of monitoring and checking tools throughout this course to ensure that performance of the machine is doing great. There was one that we didn't mention, so I'd like to sneak it in right now, and that is the Windows Memory Diagnostic. If you go down to Cortana and you type memory, one of your options will be for this Windows Memory Diagnostic tool. And notice what's going to happen is it is going to restart your system and check for issues with the RAM inside your system. So this is another great tool that we should have in our tool belt when it comes to ensuring proper performance. So when it comes to really trying to track down a performance bottleneck, we love Performance Monitor, obviously. Notice I've given you some metrics that are great to look at, and we have the physical disk and logical disk system when we are scrutinizing storage as a potential bottleneck. We know there's memory that could be the potential bottleneck, and then the processor, the system related to the processor, by the way, and then our network interface. I put these together for you in a text file in the supplemental files area, and it's called, amazingly enough, performance.txt. Inside this file, I give you these counters and my recommendations. For instance, on percent free space on the logical disk, I want greater than 15%. And I personally do much greater than 15%. On the percent idle time, I want greater than 20%. On the average disk per second read and writes, I want less than measurably 25 milliseconds. On the physical disk average disk queue length, I don't like it to be larger than 2 times the number of physical disks I have on the system. For memory, I want the percentage committed bytes in use to be less than 80%. For memory available megabytes, I obviously want this to be greater than 5% of the total RAM in the system. For our processor percent processor time, we like this to be less than 85%. For the system processor queue length, this really shouldn't be more than twice the number of CPUs that you have in the system for an extended period of time. And finally, on the network interface output queue length, I want this number less than 2. Otherwise, the network interface card might be my bottleneck. Now, I ran through those quickly because, as I said, I have those for you in the supplemental files for you to check out. I also did this as one of the Microsoft Windows posts on my blog site. You could check it right now if you wanted. That's ajsnetworking.com. And like I said, it's in the Microsoft Windows category, and it has the title Win 10 Performance Metrics. So you could find that easily on my blog as well. I think these counters are extremely important, and they really, really help us zero in on potential performance problems. So troubleshooting performance issues is a bit of an art, and we'll get better and better at it as we move throughout our careers in information technology. In this nugget, really 2 main areas. We talked about best practices. Another way to title that, of course, would be things to watch out for, right? We know we want to keep our systems free of malware. That's a best practice for performance. We know that we want to ensure that we're doing disk maintenance. After we ran through those best practices, we discussed specific performance counters that you can use to check for performance bottlenecks on your system. I hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.